So we're now going to turn to the seven practices that were surfaced through the Beloved Economies work. And before we begin our deep dive on the seven practices with our co-learners, we're first going to ground ourselves in a basic understanding of the practices and a chance to surface any key questions that you all may be holding about them. So we're going to paste a link into the chat to our overview page of the seven practices. And I welcome everyone to take a full minute or two to just scroll through, to learn, to remind yourself about what these practices are about. And then we're going to do a short activity in some small breakout groups. So we wanted you all to have a chance to meet one another, and we're going to ask you to introduce yourselves, talk about what brought you to learn about Beloved Economies, and then a question that you have about one of the seven practices. And so as we're setting up our breakout rooms, go ahead and take a minute to go ahead and click on that link and look at the seven practices. Let me go ahead and paste in the prompts. One of the things that we wanted to be able to do with all of you is really dive deep into the practices and for you to be able to hear from members of our Beloved Economies community who have put these practices into action. And so to share with us about these practices, you'll get to hear from and engage with a number of members of our co-learning community. Each of these seven people is a thought leader in their own respective field. They're beloved leaders and teammates, and two of them are also podcast hosts. Several of them are also authors. All of them are people who have really bravely departed from business as usual ways of work in their fields. And in the process, they've achieved these truly extraordinary results, these forms of success that matter for what makes life good and quality of life good. And when they each introduce themselves today, they're going to give you a teaser about their work. And then we also encourage you to learn more. And we'll have some opportunities in the second half of our session to enable you to ask them questions directly. So that will also be available. So please, Google them, follow them on social media. We'll also be sending more information about each of them and their work in the world following today's sessions. We're really excited now to be able to showcase the expertise and the insights and the amazing wisdom of our co-learning community, and to be able to dive into each of these practices and have you hear about what they mean to different folks who have been practicing them, over time. And so with that, I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Wawa. Rawa, will have you introduce yourself in just a minute, but we're really thrilled that you're going to be able to speak to the practice of prioritized relationships. So I'll hand it over to you and would love to hear what that means to you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's always wonderful to share space with the Beloved Economies team. In particular, I just want to say, Sonia, I think that you are phenomenal. Like, you are handling all this tech stuff and doing everything like a boss. And it's just, you're incredible. And yeah. But my name's Rawa Gurmatsian. I got to meet the Beloved Economies team when I was still the executive director of Push Buffalo, which is People United for Sustainable Housing, even though we do a lot more than that. And definitely live into deep, deep practice with each other to do the work that we do on the ground with our beloved community in Buffalo. I come to you from Haudenosaunee territory, Seneca land, also known as Buffalo, New York. And I was really asked to prioritizing relationships. And what does that mean to us? And what does it really mean to have that live in our bodies? We are students in my community of Adrienne Marie Brown, who I know is going to be here for the next session. So that is an incredible treat. But what does it mean to actually put into from theory to practice those emergent strategies? And one of the things that we always tell people in our community is that if you trust the people, they become trustworthy. Oftentimes, when we have low income communities, when we have frontline communities, we are marginalized, we are poor, we are these things. But I often say that what we have is an incredible amount of talent and creativity in our communities. And had we been giving the opportunities and or resources that our imagination is formidable and that we are able to do incredible things. And so that's really how we did all the amazing work that we did at Push Buffalo, whether that's, developing housing, buying up land, buying up blocks, thinking about workforce development strategies for our community, thinking about building renewable energy projects, and then taking all of that and, creating community gardens and food producing gardens, really doing all the things that, you would never think that a frontline poor, marginalized community can do. I believe it was Baldwin that said it best. What genius do you leave on the table, right? When we're not investing in the people in those communities. And I often say that everything that we do, our success is really rooted in our relationships. Um, there's a very easy way that we explain this to people and why relationships are important, even if you think that somebody's on the opposite side of you, right? Is your opponent. And part of that is we live on this beautiful blue globe and no one outside the circle. We have to come into it that no one should be outside of the circle, even if they potentially could be coming to threaten or harm us. It is up to us through our networks and our relationships to actually be in a deep practice to help them shift their principles and values. And so one of those things is that I always say, you know what, I know a little bit. Me and you, one other person, we know a little bit more together, but collectively as a human, as a community, we know a lot. And so really Push's success is rooting in finding opportunities and being a container to bring people together. And through that, we do urban planning, we do it through charrettes, we do it through games, and we have all the stakeholders. It's intergenerational, including our young people. If we're building a pocket park, for say any child up to 12 years old, why would you want to talk to me about what that park should look like, right? Because I'm not using those, but I did once when I was a kid, but I've forgotten. And so we've built pocket parks where we actually have focus groups with, 5 to 12-year-olds, and they can also select, they get to get their hands and they get to select the material, the colors, they really design what is it that they want, like a rock climbing thing and a slide, all these things that are really amazing. And, when it finally does make it up into our community, several things happen. One, there's a sense of pride from the young people that participated to say, I helped design that, or that was my idea. The other thing that happens is that it gets a lot of use. It really becomes an asset in the community because the people that are using it got to design it so they know what they want and what they need, where they are. Similarly, when we've designed senior housing, I love my elders. And they said to us, Rawa, you're cool and everything, but you don't know what we need in the apartment, how things should be laid out in the design of it. And it's like, yeah, you're 100% right. So then we created a committee that when it comes to doing anything for our elders, they are called Push Silver, giving our elders a voice, and they get to advocate for the needs of elders, right? Only in ways that they can understand. But when they designed the apartments and they were beautiful, they were very interesting because we had about 5 or 6 different designs because there are, even elders are not like monolithic. Some people had site issues, so we needed to retrofit the units for them. Some people had mobility issues, and so we had to retrofit the units for them. But our elders are 55 and over. Many of them work, and but they got to do things like in the kitchen design and what have you in ways that they could really was accessible and useful and relevant to them. So, and then oftentimes what we find is when we create the container and bring our community together, it's the young people that always want intergenerational spaces. And the elders, like, they feel so wanted, and that they are not forgotten about. And they're always, really excited to work with the young people because there's an incredible amount of wisdom, but patience that elders bring. And then there's an incredible energy that the young folks have. And so they're oftentimes, showing them how to get on TikTok and do TikTok videos or, really like neat little stuff. But it's bringing our communities and the concept of village back into it. Is it easy? Absolutely not. I'm going to share with you how much time do I have, Sonia?
Just about 2 minutes.
Oh, great. I'm going to tell you a very, very quick story of what I mean about doing the kind of work that we do is we were planning for a huge development project that the community wanted us to do. It took 2 years of meetings to even get it into some kind of shape where we could apply for the funding to make it happen. And we talked to about 2,000 people. And over that time, we started out with about 800 things that people wanted to do. And it was we were buying and rehabbing an old school building that was built in 1927. And there were about 800 things that the community wanted us. And over time, we needed to continue to shrink and shrink and shrink what could actually go in the building because we can't promise the community we're going to build them the Taj Mahal. Like, that's just not possible. But what's really amazing in the practice of really trusting in our relationships, number one, but also when you make things transparent. So once we picked out the design team had to come to the community meeting. So that's architects and what have you. So the community is learning about other barriers that might exist. Then there is, the sort of politicians and other decision makers that we also need to sway, and we need to be able to demonstrate. But what we do is we want our community members to speak for themselves, so we invite them into the container. And so oftentimes, at the end of that project, though, there were maybe 6 or 7 things that we did, and the community loves it. It's a wonderful asset that people are able to use. But more importantly, people will come up to you and say, you know what, I really wanted this other thing to happen here. We got this, but I understand why. So no one is mad. And so that's the level of trust in like really building relationships and knowing that it's going to take all of us to make something that's for all of us. You know what I mean? So I just want to really, really prioritize and talk about that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Rawa. And I think this practice is so foundational to all of the other practices. And so that's why we wanted to make sure to center on this first. So thank you for that. And now we're going to turn to our next speaker, who is going to speak to the trust there is time practice. I see a lot of questions in the chat about this because, as we know, our work feels so urgent in the spaces that we're in. How do you balance that tension with this knowledge of needing to really have space and time and trusting that there is time?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Banks Benitez, he, him. I'm really honored to be with you all today. I'm the former co-founder and CEO of a social entrepreneur accelerator called Uncharted. In 2022, we merged with another organization called Common Future. So we live on as part of Common Future. I know some of the folks from Common Future are here today. And I'm here to talk about trust there is time, which I think in some ways is ironic because I really struggle with trusting that there is time. I've been like this brute force entrepreneur my whole life. I've been wearing my work as a badge of honor in many circumstances. And I really always believed that sort of working hard is this badge of honor. Working hard, working long hours is necessary for success. And it's been a real challenge for me. And this is why I love the word practice, because I think this is truly a practice that happens on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, is practicing that there is time to get the most essential, most important work done. Our company, Uncharted, in 2020, moved to a 4-day work week. We had 100% compensation, so there was no drop in salary, but we all worked 80% of the hours. We worked 32-hour work weeks with the expectation that we were going to contribute at 100% too. So 100% compensation for 80% hours and 100% contribution. And it was a really challenging experience for me personally to, as a CEO of this organization, and of course, 2020 was a chaotic time, feeling the scarcity of going out and raising capital, raising funding for our team, making sure we had enough time throughout the course of the week, and of course, taking care of our team and trying to support the mental health of our team was one of the main drivers for us moving to a 4-day work week. And the 4-day work week actually ended up being a success. We hired a third-party evaluator to measure the results of a 3-month pilot. And then we made it permanent company policy. And then we practiced, going back to that word, the 4-day work week over the next 2 years before we merged with Common Future. And in some ways, the 4-day work week, there's a lot of popularity about it now. At the time, there was much less, fewer resources and articles and case studies about the 4-day work week. Now I'm just seeing a lot out there. But at the time, it was in some ways countercultural of moving to a 4-day work week. And I think in general, whether you're working on a 5-day work week or 6 days, 7 days, 4 days, whatever it is, we are living in a moment where our work is infused with a sense of huge urgency. And that urgency is well founded, whether it's tackling climate change or fighting for justice. There's a sense of urgency to address these big issues. There's also that urgency infuses into our bodies, into ourselves, in terms of how we go about our day. And as a CEO and as a leader and a contributor and an employee at this company, I just noticed that I was steeped in all of this culture of urgency, of rushing. And I think if you're like me, you may feel sort of an adversarial relationship to time, where there's this race against time or trying to fit everything into our time. And that for me was eating away at me as a leader. And the 4-day work week, you might think, allowed us, or maybe made it worse, because there was less time. We had to do more with less. We had to be more productive. We had to push faster and further and achieve more with less time. But in some ways, for us, and in my experience personally, the 4-day work week really challenged and asked me to revisit my relationship to time. And it made me think more about trusting that there is time to get the most important work done, and recognizing that there is some work that is more important than other work. And that I told myself a story as a leader, as an employee, as a worker, that everything was important, that I would work late into the night trying to check everything off of my to-do list. And there was a rushing because I just had created such a full, overflowing plate for myself. One of the things we did at Uncharted when we were moving to a 4-day work week was we realized that we had too many priorities. We had too many activities. We had too many work streams. And we tried to get better at prioritizing and deprioritizing, at really focusing on the most essential work for us as a team. And so in some ways, when we did our strategic planning, we did our sort of planning for the year ahead or the next quarter, we actually allocated more time, not less, to those activities, because we felt like that was where the real debate and discussion and conversation was needed, to really say, okay, if we're going to trust that there is time to get the most important work done, we first need to understand what is the most important work, and therefore what is not the most important work. So we actually trusted that if we spent more time, not less, on prioritizing and on deprioritizing, we actually would have more spaciousness to spend more time doing what was really, truly important for our organization. I sometimes tell teams now as they move to a 4-day work week or think about it, that it's possible for you to work less, but still spend more time on the things that matter the most if you redesign your work and redesign your week. I remember as a CEO, so many times decisions I made, ones that I'm proud of and ones that I think I made mistakes around. And there was a theme, which was that the worst decisions I made often came from a place when I was rushing, when I was feeling time scarcity, when I felt a scarcity mindset overtaking me when it came to money or time or whatever. And that actually, that was the common denominator across some of the worst decisions I made, was a sense of rushing. So there's a courage, I think, in letting things take the time they take, and also recognizing that we shouldn't just be patient for things to come to pass. We want to be ambitious in how we go out and tackle our big social and environmental issues in our world, and also recognize that not everything is truly essential, and that potentially we have told ourselves a story of importance. We've told ourselves a story of urgency. We've told ourselves a story that we need to cram everything in, when perhaps trusting that there is time allows us to slow down and recognize what's truly important. And for me, it has been a daily practice. It is something that I come back to and still struggle with, which I think maybe is why I can relate to so many folks who find themselves in similar circumstances. But for me, what I've loved about this research is that trusting there is time is something that we have the chance every new hour, every day, every new meeting, every new planning period to really think, do we have the time before us? And what are things that potentially are in our way or distracting us from what's really, truly most impactful and important? So thank you for listening. I'm excited to contribute further on this.
Yeah, thank you, Banks. And I think the candor about what it means to have to really grapple with this on an ongoing basis is something that really resonates with me. I think resonates with a lot of folks in the chat as well. And we know that there's a lot of relationship between trusting that there is time and being able to prioritize those relationships that Rawa was speaking to. And so thank you for illuminating that as well. I'd love to welcome our next speaker, Eugene, who will speak to us about the shared decision-making power practice. So handing it over to you, Eugene.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you, Banks, for that. Hi, everyone. My name is Eugene Kim. I'm the principal at Faster Than 20, And for the past 20 years, I've been helping groups of all sizes and shapes collaborate more effectively. What that's looked like over the past decade is I'm really focused on helping practitioners develop strong muscles and habits around collaboration. And so when we think about this question around sharing decision-making power, the first thing I would ask is, what the heck does that even mean? I know it can get pretty fuzzy and confusing pretty quickly for a lot of reasons, and I think the best way to kind of explain this or to talk about this is to think about an experience that I'm sure all of you have had, probably many, many times. And so, what I want you all to do is to take a moment, and I want you to just think of a time when you were with a group of people. Could be friends, could be family, could be colleagues, whomever. Think about a time when you were with a group and you all had to figure out where to go for lunch. Okay, so just take a couple of seconds to try and think about and relive some of those scenarios. As you start thinking of some of those times in your past, how did the experience go? Did you find a place to eat in a relatively quick and efficient manner? Did everyone feel good about the choice? Did everyone feel nourished and happy afterwards? So think about what the actual outcome of that process was. And as you relieve this experience of trying to figure out where to go for lunch, and I hope it's not too traumatic for any of you, I also want you to just ask yourself this: who in that situation had the decision-making power? My guess is that for most of you, the answer is it was probably shared. Maybe it was a little bit mushy. We don't really know who had the decision-making power. We didn't really talk about it. Sometimes in past examples, we've said, okay, you decide, right? I'm sure some of you have been in situations like that as well. Um, and sometimes when I've been in that situation, I just didn't even want to be the decision maker. I always want to have agency, right? I want my needs and opinions to be expressed, but I also want everyone else in my group to have a good experience. And so I want people to voice their opinions in that situation, no matter what. Um, I think that most people, almost certainly everybody in this group, but I'd say most people in general are probably pretty similar in that we want everybody in a group to have a good experience, to have their needs met, all those different things. And the only way to get there is for everyone to have a say. Um, that being said, there's a very broad spectrum of what sharing power looks like that accommodates this, including what I would say is probably the most common way of doing it, which is to have one person hold the decision-making power and then asking everyone else what they want. And that's absolutely a form of the shared power that Jess was kind of referring to in the opening, even if it's not actually shared decision-making. And honestly, I think there are many situations where that's totally fine. You can have a lot of agency without holding the ultimate decision-making power, and not everybody has to have equal decision-making power in everything all the time. In fact, I'm sure many of you can think of examples when it's not desirable. So if I'm modeling this principle of shared decision-making power for you, in some ways it's by design. I don't want you to think that any of these principles are some kind of cure-all recipe that you just follow and they just work. They're not, none of these are. But if I were to try to offer something that might be clarifying rather than muddling, I'd want to offer three things. First off, I just want to repeat what Rawa said because I thought that was really beautiful. And I think it applies here with shared decision-making power too. She said, if you trust people, they become trustworthy. I think what that means is it's ultimately about shifting the mindsets that many of us have, which is I know better, to this mindset of we know better. We all know better if we come together. We've all been in situations where we felt like we individually know better than other people. I'm sure those of you who are parents, have experienced that many times with their kids. And sometimes, often, it's even true. But more often than not, I think there's kind of a well-intentioned arrogance that results in this mindset. It comes from being in this privileged place of being exposed to multiple points of view and of having time and space to actually make sense of all the complexity out there in the world. In reality, like it or not, we all have blind spots. And even without those blind spots, we just can't know everything, even if we do our best to try to listen to everyone, to absorb all of that. And so it just makes more sense, it's more efficient, and it's more effective to bring a broader group into the same position that we're in, to expose them to multiple points of view, to create the time and space for more people to make sense of things, as opposed to trying to put a gatekeeper there and have that person have all the decision-making power. Doing this results in greater shared understanding, greater empathy, greater trust, greater ownership, and ultimately, I think, better results. And there are many, many examples of this. But I know that doing this can be scary to most people, and it's why most of us don't want to do it. And I think this brings us to the second point I want to share, which is just we need to broaden our vision of what's possible when you give people agency, even at scale. I think what Banks was talking about, his whole example around this mindset that he had around urgency and around not having enough time, and then trying something different and realizing that not only did he have enough time, but it actually resulted in better results. I think so many practitioners are starting to realize this about this principle as well, that when you actually distribute shared decision-making power, it results in better results. And having more people try things and experience that and able to share those things mean that we can rely on those people to support us in the process of doing that. So it's really important for us to just start with this idea that, you know what, maybe it is possible and maybe it comes to better results. This kind of leads me to the third and last point, which is that applying this principle skillfully requires that we have muscles for seeing and talking about power. So that dinner example that I mentioned before is one that I've actually started to use with clients as kind of an exercise in developing our muscles around power. And I want to shout out my friends my friends at the Asian Law Caucus who helped develop this exercise with me. When you do this exercise, when you start imagining scenarios and when you start talking about it, you realize, number one, that can be actually really uncomfortable to talk about power. Right? Talking about power and being really explicit about it can be just difficult. You also start to see that there's just all sorts of dynamics that are going on, even in our kind of casual friend group or in our family group or in a group of colleagues. And those dynamics actually affect the decision-making process, regardless of who or who doesn't officially have decision-making power. Until you develop those muscles, you're not going to be successful in any kind of process of shared decision-making power. And the only way you can develop that muscle is by exercising it, by experimenting, by flexing it, by trying, by practicing, and often by failing too. So giving yourself space to practice all these principles, not the one about shared decision-making power, is, I think, really important. And with that, just want to pass the baton back to Sonia.
Yeah. Thank you, Eugene. And I really appreciate what you mentioned around these practices not being a cure-all. These are not meant to be prescriptive. They really are meant to be ways of reflecting and different questions that can be brought into the conversation. And so what I'd love to do now is pose a question to you and to Banks around some of the things that have been coming in from the chat. And I think one theme that I've been seeing quite a bit is when it comes to these practices, how do you convince others in leadership and teams that you're a part of that prioritizing relationship, that trusting there is time, that sharing decision-making power is something that makes sense? How do you bring them along in that journey, particularly if you're not the primary decision maker? Maybe it's a board, maybe it's, other colleagues that you're trying to really have be bought in. So I would love to hear examples or stories that have come up for either of you.
Banks, how long did it take you all to come to that decision to go to a 4-day work week?
Yeah, I was the CEO, so I was in a place of positional power in that moment. What I've found has been that, especially with something that seems quite significant, like moving to a 4-day work week, the value of a time-bound experiment can be really helpful. So before you say we're going to roll this out forevermore, whether it's the 4-day work week, whether it's about a new opportunity to share power, I think you're saying let's try it for this one instance, and then let's try it again, and then do it one more time. There's an incrementalism I think is powerful, where all of a sudden it begins to become part of the norm. And so when I am advising teams on moving to a 4-day work week now, it's very much saying try a pilot first before you commit to it forever, as a way to experiment and to learn that way. And then there's lots of strategies in terms of how to convince people in places of power to explore things, but I've just found the idea of something that feels more conditional to be quite effective.
I'm just going to echo that. I know that Bobby is going to be talking about prototyping later, right? But I think so often when we're trying to embrace change, we all just try to solve the biggest problem first. One of the reasons why I use that exercise around like talking about like who's making decisions as to like where you go to dinner and talking about power, it feels kind of like soft and trivial and it's like okay, but it's also kind of funny and we can kind of talk about it. And if we have a failed lunch decision, it's okay, right? We're all going to be okay. But what happens when we start talking about it is we develop the muscles, we start to see what's possible, we're even willing to experiment in more bold ways. And each and every one of the things can build on top of each other. So that incrementalism that you're describing, Banks, I think is so real and so important.
Wonderful. Thank you both. So we are going to move to our next practice now, which is Reckon with History. And we had been hoping to be joined by our colleague, Jessica Norwood, who is an incredible leader of Runway and, was really hoping to be with all of you, but she is on a delayed flight and life happens. So what we're going to do with this session instead is ask some of our different speakers that are speaking to these other practices if they would be willing to just share a brief insight or a line or two about this practice of reckoning with history. And just to ground us in this practice in particular, I think one of the things that has been coming up as we've been having these conversations is these systems and cultures that we're rooted in. And of course, we know that many of those systems are really byproducts of white supremacy and racialized capitalism and many of the other forms of extraction and oppression that have been part of our society for a long time. And so folks in the chat have been naming scarcity mindset. They have been naming, how do we think about the ego and fear that often comes with feeling like you need to accrue power. And so particularly with Reckon with History, would love to hear, I'll have, Eugene and Banks, I'll give you each a chance to reflect a little bit on what this practice means to you, but then I'll also invite some of our other speakers who we'll hear from in just a second. I'll bring on Bobby and Brooking as well, and would love to hear some thoughts from them on this particular practice. So whichever of you would like to start.
I'll go ahead and start. I don't have a lot to say about it other than I think when we think about all of these principles, it's so important for us not to treat them as binaries, right? You don't reckon with history or you don't, right? You either do or you don't. It's not binary in that way. Sonia, when you talk about, grappling with issues around white supremacy and, racialized capitalism and all those things, that is a scary conversation to have, right? And that is like, we're never going to finish having those conversations, right? Those are conversations by nature that's going to take a long time. But I think all of us can actually start, and many of us already do, whenever we come into a situation, we look at history, right? We'll look at the background. Who has relationships with whom? Why are some people in this situation unhappy and other people aren't, right? Like we're all making room for that already at some level. And I think the big point of like the book and the principles that are espoused is when we make more time for that, when we go deeper, when we recognize that we are all basically in our full selves, like our history as well. We're bringing our history into the table, and it's important and it's valuable, and it's actually enjoyable in some ways to be seen by others, to have that history, to be able to talk about those things. So many things come up that are beneficial when we make the time to reckon with our history.
Thank you for that, Eugene.
Yeah, I'll echo that very briefly, which is I think we certainly reckoned with our own history imperfectly over the years. And especially when you're in a scarcity mindset of feeling like there's not much time to get everything done, it's really easy to paper over some of these histories, these relationships, these stories. And in some ways, we really try to prioritize that as the bedrock foundation for building higher trust. And if you operate in high trust teams, then you can get more work done. And there's that idea. I love the idea of like when I'm trusted, and I can be smarter and more capable. And so I think that sort of digging deep into some of these pieces created a foundation for our team to move forward. And certainly was not a perfect process, but something that we tried to do so that there was deeper sense of understanding and trust that propelled the work.
Thanks, Banks. Brooking or Bobby, anything you want to share?
Sure. Happy to share a little story to sort of really paint this picture of why this is so important to understanding history. And I'm going to be talking about prototyping a little bit later, but as a community-centered planning and design firm in New Orleans, I would share this story, which was our role in designing the recovery process post-Katrina. And I suspect that many of you saw that tragic event unfold on television and in the news in many ways. And I dare say there was no trust amongst any person, especially the African American community, the more disadvantaged community, and deeply rooted in our history around racism and white supremacy. And it just played out right in front of everybody, nationally and internationally. And what we know from doing this work over many, many years, and certainly in that moment, was I would say two things. First of all, people have spoken about being scared. When you see your city underwater and people talking about New Orleans not deserving to come back, that was the scariest thing in the world. But what I'm not afraid of anymore is bringing everybody to the table and understanding how important it is, especially in the context of our deep history and our troubled history. And I know that it's going to be hard, but I'm not afraid to do it because anything can happen. And I trust the process of being open and honest and transparent. So I will just say that coming in with that understanding and knowing that without total transparency and inclusion and authenticity, that we would not have a chance to rebuild this city. And that meant that everyone deserved a seat at the table, especially those people in marginalized communities, and also the people who created the city of New Orleans. I'll just add this other little thing. When we went through all the troubled times during the pandemic, and George Floyd and people marching in the streets during the pandemic and such, there was this great sign on the marquee at the Joy Theater, and it said, "Everything you love about New Orleans is because of Black people." And it was so true. It still is so true. And going back to the whole Katrina recovery, had we not been able to create that inclusive environment for recovery and resilience and redesign of this most important city in terms of its history in Louisiana, in the United States, and in the world, then we probably wouldn't be here today. So that would be the story I would share.
Great. Yes, thank you, Eugene and Banks and Bobby and Brooking. We have you speaking to another practice soon. So I'll also just have you speak to your reflections on Reckon with History there. But I just want to thank you, Eugene. I want to thank you, Banks, for sharing with us. Bobby will come to you in a little bit just to talk about another practice, but really appreciate you all stepping in to share about this practice because there are so many different layers to it. There's so many different perspectives that we really have to take into account. And one thing that I'll say, just as a plug for our colleague Jessica, is that she is releasing a book that really speaks to reckoning with the history of our economic system in particular. And the book is coming out in October. It's called Believe in You Money. What would it look like if the economy loved Black people? So pre-orders just got started for that. It's already an Amazon bestseller. And we're going to drop a link in the chat so that you can check out her book and support by pre-ordering a copy as well. So with that, I will turn us to our next practice. So thank you, Brooking, for joining us, and would love it if you could introduce yourself and then talk a bit about this practice of seek difference, which I think is very much connected to some of the concepts that we were just talking about as well. So I'll hand it to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Sonia. Hi, everybody. So I work with a little group with Rebecca Petzel, who's here today. So shout out to my collaborator on pretty much everything. We're called Emergence Collective. And that's actually a great place to start, because a huge part of what our approach to working with networks and alliances and group efforts to try to create social change is about trusting in collective intelligence. And for collective intelligence to operate at its best, difference is essential. And so this principle is pretty woven into our approach to practice. And as I was thinking about, what to talk about today, it's not just building in time to seek difference, but I think it's building in time to seek and welcome and integrate difference. And a big part that I'm seeing show up in the chat comments that I want to reflect back as well is how important understanding how our bodies are designed is to being able to effectively seek difference, and working with somatic aspects of the fact that we have nervous systems that are hardwired to fear difference in a lot of situations, and how we have evolved as bodies. And we often don't touch on that. I found in social practice, there's a lot of worlds in which we keep the conversation at the mind level. And then that makes for way less likelihood of true transformative conversation and transformative work. So one of the things that I'm thinking about when it comes to seeking difference, which of course connects with every other principle, is how profoundly important the willingness to slow down is, not just in the sense of designing processes that have time to make sure that, to go back to Eugene's dinner or lunch table metaphor, is everybody invited to the table that we actually need to be in the table for what we want to talk about in this lunch. And, we've often heard of the idea of table setting, right? But it's not just table setting. It's also, when people get to a table, how do we welcome everybody at the table in a good way? And how do we prepare the people who might have been having lunch together for years before more people join the table to actually be ready in their bodies and in their minds to truly welcome difference and be willing to be changed by the experience of receiving others' perspectives. So a very concrete example, Rebecca and I worked on this project that's mentioned in the book with a group of doctors and researchers and patients who were, because of this beautiful PCORI grant process that happened in the US a decade or so ago, were funded to try to get patients involved in research on their own medical outcomes. And when we started talking to these patients, they were carrying a lot of trauma from their really negative experiences of how they were treated in the healthcare system. And anybody who's, a lot of us unfortunately have negative experiences like that. So the more we listened to the patients, we were understanding what were the ground rules that we needed to ask the doctors and researchers to agree to, so that the space would be safe for the patients to actually feel like they were being heard in a way that they had no historic evidence of having been heard. So there's an element of reckoning with history here too. And for the doctors and patients, it was a little bit of a different prep process where we're helping them prepare to integrate a different kind of knowledge to welcome multiple ways of knowing, is another point in the 7 principles that we talk about today. And each of these processes took time. They took real conversations. They took real relationship building with doctors and patients on our design team ahead of time to model the ability to work together across this really significant gap of difference that this project was navigating. And then all of that setup helped create the possibility of something new happening in everybody's experience that was more engaging and exciting than the research that was able to happen without patient input. So that's one particular example that comes to mind. And another one that I'm thinking about that I think is a common one probably for a lot of people in this group is and this happens as if you're starting a social movement effort and you start with the people you know, and you get down the road a little bit and realize you do not have the right people at the table to really do strategy and to really meaningfully move the work forward. And then what happens? And I was part of a really beautiful early stage social movement process that was kind of a classic white environmentalist led effort. And to the credit of these white leaders, they all recognize this isn't right. We're talking about issues that relate to oil and gas and climate issues, and the communities most impacted by those issues are not represented in our conversation. And they paused the process for a year or so as they did the work of building the relationships to bring in the different representation, and not just representation, back to Eugene's decision-making piece, but meaningful power, roles on steering committees, like thinking ahead about if you're welcoming more people who have different backgrounds into the conversation, why are those backgrounds important? What role will they have beyond just being at a table? Being very careful not to tokenize and all of that. And then in that process, also the white environmental groups did a whole bunch of trainings and had to reckon with their history and with the way that they had historically operated as a movement and the failings of that movement in its past iterations. And what I've seen in this latest iteration, this movement is called Break Free from Plastic, is some of the best practice I've seen in the environmental and climate space of actually integrating difference in a really powerful way. So that's another piece that comes to mind. And then the other piece I want to speak to is just back to the aspect of how we hold fear in our bodies around difference. I think one of the most powerful things we can do, and again, coming back to this principle of slowing down, is as a facilitator, whenever I'm supporting a group or even having a one-on-one with somebody who is where you're having difference, and you may have sought it because you're in a design process where you want somebody to play the skeptic, or you may be dealing with like major racial differences that have these deep histories that I was talking about in the environmental movements, and different experiences of class and race and background and personal embodied experience of injustice. And in these processes, to invite everybody in the conversation, whatever version of the conversation, whatever meeting you're in, to truly slow down and be in our bodies for the conversation, and have ground rules around things like suspend your sense of certainty, let go of believing that you know, trust that together we will discover more about the things we all care about than we are able to otherwise, and practice curiosity. Where difference occurs, recognize that your body may have a fear response and just notice it without judgment or blame, and working with practices to breathe into and through that, and finding the place of curiosity and openness inside of every interaction, every conversation, every dialogue. And I feel like those elements of how we show up as beings for these conversations actually have some of the most transformative effects in terms of how the work moves forward in a healthy and truly integrating the best of difference kind of way. So I'll stop there for now.
Perfect. Thank you, Brooking. Really appreciate that. And, particularly the idea of being alert to where difference shows up in our bodies and feeling that at a somatic level and not just at an intellectual level. So thank you for that. Thank you to all of our speakers that have spoken thus far. We have 2 more, but we're first going to take a break because we know you all have been hanging in with us for the past 90 minutes. And so as we're at the halfway mark, we will now take a 10-minute break. When we come back, we'll hear from our last 2 speakers. We'll pull in a question from the audience, and then we will move to 2 different types of breakout groups. One will be an affinity group, and then the other will be an option for you to revisit with these speakers and ask them direct questions that have been surfacing for you. So with that, we encourage you to step away, do whatever you need to do, and then come back to us at 40 after the hour, and we will continue on our journey. Thank you so much. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to take a brief, refreshing break, and you've been able to get all the things you need for our next half of the session that's ahead of us, our next 90 minutes. So what I will do as folks are coming back into the room and rejoining us is just set us up to hear from our last 2 speakers who are going to be diving into our last 2 practices, and then we'll have a little bit of Q&A with them. So as you all come back in, I would be excited to welcome Bobby back to the stage, who is going to talk to us about the prototype early and often practice. And so, Bobby, I'll hand it over to you if you could introduce yourself a little bit, and then would love to hear your insights.
Sure. Thank you, Sonia. Hi, I'm Bobby Hill. I'm a principal at Concordia Community-Centered Planning and Design in New Orleans. And it's such an honor and a delight to be here with all of you today. And I would assume you are sensing as you hear people talk about these practices, the interconnectivity and interdependence amongst all these ideas and how important they are to each other. I know I'm certainly feeling that as I listen to people's stories. So prototyping early and often is really fundamental to the work that we do, both in terms of our organization, Concordia, which is our one-word mission statement from the Latin root of the word concord, which means agreement among people and harmony among things. And we really believe that, and we believe that that happens best with a co-design process, because all of us are smarter than any of us. And having done this practice and developed skills and experiences and tools around this work for the past almost 30 years, I know how true this is. The more the merrier, definitely the more creative, and the better the results. And the other thing that happens prototyping early and often, which to us is an iterative process over time, where people are invited to the table. And they are invited in a way that they can come and go as works for them, and therefore when they participate, whether they've been there earlier or not, they still have an opportunity to fully engage. But hopefully, through the process that is so engaging, people come back early and often to prototype early and often. And there really are two fundamental results in doing that. One is, of course, you create a better result, you create a better product, you create a better design, you create something that is definitely more resilient and more successful. And then the other actual product of doing this work is building community, which may be even the more important result. And that gets to the all of us are smarter than any of us, and working from a we position rather than a me position, and how important that is. And certainly in this divided community and world that we live in right now, it's so incredibly important. And the other thing that recognizing the differences and the divisiveness that we have in our communities, what I know and have seen time and time again is when you open that door and you invite all of the end users to the table, anybody that's impacted by whatever planning or design process that you are embarking upon, all of those people impacted deserve a seat at the table early and from the beginning, and not invited to respond to something that's already been designed. They have plenty to contribute in the beginning. And again, the more people that are there, what I also have seen time and time again is people from all walks of life, people of all ages, ethnicities, races, and political opinions or not. If you create an environment where people honestly feel like they are invited to the table and they see through an iterative process their contribution and learn from each other, then those issues that divide can fade away. And then what becomes present is people sitting down together collectively to do the work and build a stronger community. So one of the things that we have found in doing this work that I wanted to share as we think about prototyping, because this is an iterative process over time, that we recognize that, you know, as architects and planners and people with years of engagement experience, we bring our experience and our expertise and our technology and technical information to the table. But we certainly don't know everything. And more often than not, we're from away. And so it's even more important to create an environment where the local expertise and the local knowledge feels comfortable and included and a desire to participate. So one of the things that we have found that has been incredibly helpful is to reach out to the communities and identify people who we call community fellows. And these are leaders in the community who are not, I wouldn't say necessarily really high profile leaders, but people who are deeply connected. They have relationships to institutions and organizations. And more than anything, when somebody in their neighborhood sees them, they trust them, they know them, they're willing to sit and listen, and they're willing to listen and be invited through an invitation with this person to participate in a bigger process. So we interview and train in our planning process and bring these people to the table as equal partners in doing the work, who I would say their main three roles would be to, again, help invite and bring people to the table, to bring their own expertise as anybody else to the table, and to help build that trust. And through helping facilitate as a citizen planner, as a partner at the table in an iterative process. So if for those of you that read the book, you understand where we spoke of sharing and testing, creating space for learning and creating, and really testing people's assumptions without judgment, if you will, because we want there to be an open opportunity to throw things out and to test and to see that if something doesn't work, that's fine. There are other ideas that can come to the table. And synthesizing this information together, and creating a culture of learning that is shared, that is open, that is genuine. And if you can do that, then people will shift their energy from how they may typically have participated in processes, oftentimes from a very defensive position, to being open to what it means to work together and to collaborate. So I will pass it on now to the next one.
Yeah, thank you, Bobby. Really appreciate that, and really appreciate what you're naming around there being importance of having people come into the space from the beginning and not just, later on in the process. So with that, I'm going to pass it to our next speaker, Tatewi. If you could just introduce yourself and then speak to the practice of really thinking about sourcing from multiple ways of knowing. Your insights from there would be great. Thanks.
Sure. Hamidakipi Yuha Chante Washana Betuzapi Tadewi means Amachapi na Ogwala Lakota na System Wapitan Dakota Wia Hemacha Ogwala Makoche and Mataha. Greetings, relatives. My name is Tatewi Means, and I am Indigenous. I am Ogwala Lakota and Sisseton Wapitan Dakota of the Oceti Sakowin Nation. I come to you from my Oglala homelands in the heart of our sacred Black Hills, in what today is called South Dakota. I am proud to be representing my community, my people, and my organization, Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. In my introduction, the very introduction standard protocol is to introduce ourselves in our language, but also what I said was I greet each of you with a heartfelt handshake virtually, though we're not in person, and just hope that the things that I have to share resonate in some way, and you can take something from my lived experience and from what the work we're doing at Thunder Valley. So we're a grassroots nonprofit organization right in the heart of Oglala territory. We're on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which is one of 9 tribal nations, and again, what is called South Dakota. But this is traditionally our homelands of the Oceti Sakowin Nation. And so I just want to acknowledge that and the land that we are occupying and our traditional connection to that land. which ties in perfectly with sourcing from multiple ways of knowing, because at the heart of this teaching and this practice is really about recognizing the inherent value and worth of different worldviews and really trying to center the worldviews of others that are not colonial, that are not capitalistic, and that really value relationships and our interconnectedness, not only to one another as human beings, but our interconnectedness to all living beings, the earth, the animal nation, the plant nation, everything that is supposed to be living in balance, but what settler colonialism and capitalism has turned on its head when the focus became power dynamics. And so what I really appreciate about this practice in particular is because it brings visibility to people like me, Indigenous people, where our inherent ways of knowing and our inherent knowledge as Indigenous people has often been disregarded, has been outlawed, has been on the verge of extinction by design and intention from the US government and Catholic Church, through boarding schools, through assimilation era, through relocation programs, all of these different time periods throughout what is now United States history, very intentional actions towards eliminating our worldview as Indigenous people. And this has happened time and time again to other communities of color, to other marginalized communities, is the systematic practice of eliminating our thought and worldview. And so, the work that we do at Thunder Valley, our vision is liberation for Lakota people. And at the heart of that struggle, at the heart of that fight and resistance is healing. And so to me, central to this practice has to be the starting point of healing. All of us and each of us have to heal from colonization. That has to be the starting point. Because if we're not willing to cleanse ourselves of those ideologies and worldviews and practices, then anything we try to integrate and incorporate will just be a practice. It will just be something we check off. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's something people check off the list. Affirmative action, something people check off. It wasn't inherent and absorbed into their worldview. So for us to really be able to practice this and respect what it brings to our conversations, to our spaces, we have to be willing to rethink and reframe and implement a different worldview. Doesn't have to be Indigenous. It can be whatever it is appropriate for your spaces and your communities. But for us as Indigenous people, this is so important because of all of the attempts to eliminate it from existence. And so how do we do this? Well, bringing in, making spaces, as Bobby talked about, but how do we ensure they're safe? Because for a long time as Indigenous people, it was outlawed, but then they're like, wait a second, these are valuable teachings, and we're going to now take them and steal them and make money off them and profit from them. Okay, so there's a lot of appropriation of Indigenous knowledge, especially when it comes to traditional plants and medicines or our relationship with climate and the climate justice movement. And so how do we create spaces that are safe for people like me and other peoples of color to share these other ways of knowing, with the assurity that we will not have those appropriated or stolen? And so that's something to consider when you're in these spaces. And it's not just about acknowledging these views in the beginning of your processes, but also having that diversity of thought and worldview at the table from the beginning, within your organizations, on your boards, as the primary decision makers. So we're not just consulted. So we're not just, the federal government is really good at this, tribal consultations. We're going to consult with the Indian nations, but not listen to them and do exactly what we wanted to anyway. So really making sure you're not doing it from a paternalistic approach, but really considering how to incorporate and implement those worldviews at a foundational level and not just an exercise. And then the last thing that I wanted to touch on and share is, for us as Indigenous people and in my community, it's really important that we value the voice of our youth and our elders. The word for youth is Wakayaja, which means sacred beings. So understanding and recognizing that sacredness that they bring to the conversation and that inherent wisdom that they carry with them in finding solutions and finding a way forward, because they're so close to Creator. They come to us sacred. And so recognizing that they carry that responsibility too for our communities and valuing their voices and the knowledge that they bring to the work that we do.
Great. Thank you so much. And I wanted to pull in some of the comments that have been coming in from the chat for questions for you. And I'll start with you, Tatawin, and then I'll pass it to Bobby and Brooking as well. But so many people have been naming what it feels like to ground in our bodies, to really sort of grapple with what this means at an individual level. And I was wondering if you could talk about, for you, you were naming, for example, really looking at the wisdom of elders and of young people. And have there been particular ways of knowledge or imagination or new insight that you feel have come from those that you have sourced different ways of knowing from, even in your own space and you as an individual as well?
Sure. First, just want to acknowledge all of the feedback in the chat. Thank you. It's really good. Feels good to see that, and to acknowledge my other Indigenous relatives I see on there, some Anishinaabe relatives. So just acknowledging that. I think one example I would share is in our design process. So one of our 8 initiatives at Thunder Valley is our regenerative community development. We have 34 acres where we're actually building a regenerative community. So with some pretty high sustainability goals, all rooted in our Lakota lifeways, of course, from design to the architecture to the actual construction. But when we're designing our spaces, a part of our healing journey is also healing our relationship with physical spaces, because for Indigenous communities in particular, and we're very rural, it's often just imposed on us, right? What our communities will look like, what our housing will look like. And so providing that opportunity and space for our community members to have a voice in how their community should look and feel and smell and taste and all of those things in these design sessions, starting with youth, starting with vulnerable populations in our community, going into our jails, having that feedback from community members that don't often get asked, that are often overlooked, and incorporating what their vision is. And then being that liaison and the interface with outside design companies that are mostly non-Indigenous. And how do we hold these design companies, engineering firms, architecture firms, all of these things to a high standard of cultural competency in a really tangible way. So for instance, we built and designed a playground around community and especially youth feedback that resembles our sacred Black Hills. There are 7 sacred sites for the Lakota in the Black Hills, and there's some teachings and stories around there. But the first iterations of the drawing from the design was a star quilt pattern and a 4-direction symbol. Probably the most stereotypical imagery you can have when you think of Indigenous people, especially for Plains culture. And so we said, that's not good enough. You have to do better. Here are some books, here are some reading materials. And this is a company that's been working in Indian country for decades. So you would assume they would do better, know better. So gave them some homework to do and said, come back and try again, listening to the feedback of our community and our young people. They did, and it was several rounds of communication, so it definitely extended the timeline, but it was important that we listened to our community and incorporated that regardless of the timelines for design and all of these things. And so really pushing back on outside partners and holding them accountable to hearing our community voices.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that point about not just having process to engage, but to have the actual exchange and to be able to push back and have accountability in those processes as well. So thank you for sharing that. Bobby and Brooking, would also love to hear from your perspectives. What have you been able to experience as you've been at these different tables in terms of new ways of imagining or different types of insights that have come from the various people that you have been in relationship with as well?
The thing that comes to my mind right now is, and if anybody out there is familiar with the U process, it's a lovely map for this piece I'm speaking to, but there's something about silence and the unknown as a way of knowing and as a piece of the whole, and inviting groups to be able to participate in their own sort of meditative discovery process in the middle of whatever strategy processes or other things that we're doing, and inviting often time outside, time alone, time in small groups to just have a human conversation, and mixing up the ways that we engage and approach whatever it is a group is working on can be kind of just never ceases to amaze me, the power that can come from those pauses and letting go of our really structured approaches, and just trusting in a little bit of quiet and how powerful that can be.
Great. Poppy?
Yeah, I will share another quick story that that exceeded any expectation I may have had in terms of the power of the voice of a community. Prior to Katrina, in Central City, New Orleans, which is one of the most historically significant African American communities in the city, and it's in the center of the city, hence Central City. Really the source of much of the civil rights activism that happened in New Orleans, and a neighborhood that was suffering from major disinvestment, as is typical in many urban areas, especially around primarily African American communities. And we led or facilitated, I should say, a planning process to create a neighborhood plan here in Central City, where we had, I believe we had 10 community fellows, and acknowledging what Taiwan said, we had many of those, half of those were students who have such an important voice at the table in thinking about the future of their community. It was about an 18-month process where we went and developed a plan for the physical, cultural, social, organizational, educational, and economic domains of a thriving community. And actually, at the end of it, instigated by all of the people that participated, they created a community manifesto that laid the groundwork for how the community would continue to develop and be held to account by anybody and everybody that came to try to do work there. So moving forward after Katrina, there were certain neighborhoods that were selected for a specific infusion of money to redevelop a sort of significant hub in the community. And Central City already had a plan. They had updated their plan post Katrina. Everybody in the community participated. They had investment in this plan, and again, it was holistic in consideration of the entire community and all the things that help a community be strong and thrive. So the city comes in and says, okay, we're going to give you this money. We're going to do this revamp of this important streetscape, this important part of your community to catalyze redevelopment. And it did not take into consideration the earlier planning that the community had done, and nor was it located in the right place to catalyze this. And the community came together and said, not no, but hell no. And we want your money, but we do not want that plan, and we won't accept it. And we will tell you, and we know what's best because of all the work that we've done. So they actually sort of pushed the city back on their heels. The city said, okay. And they were able to push the city back and to bring forth the plan that they had developed. And that's what was ultimately built. And if I could show you today the recommendations that came out of the planning process before Katrina and what happened afterward and what this neighborhood looks like now, and show you those recommendations, they all are being met, and they all are, everything is happening with the community's ongoing participation and being true to their design and their recommendations. And it's really quite fascinating. And actually, this is where we have our office, and we're very happy to be here.
Great. Thank you all. I really appreciate you speaking to these three practices and providing such tangible examples of what it means to have these practices be in place in ways that enable communities to actually hold institutions accountable, and also to name, their own expertise and to really center that as the core compass for this work.